but Lucy Harris is at Ringwood Unitarians. She's a liturgist and poet. Robin Hanford is outreach officer at this chapel, has recently been studying religious studies and theology at Leeds. And Claire MacDonald, Reverend Dr. Claire MacDonald, is minister to Lewisham Meeting House. She trained for the ministry at Harris Manchester College and at Heathrow. And she has a PhD in critical and creative writing from UEA. So our panel will give their responses, and then we'll move to a more general discussion, and we'll take our panel in that order, starting with Lucy Harris.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? It's a dangerous thing to give me a microphone. I'll try and stick to the time. I'd like to start by saying something about an incident that happened to me and my husband while we were on our honeymoon 35 years ago. There were two men in a field outside our hotel room, and they were having a blazing argument. I could tell this because they were shouting, they were gesticulating, the Gallic shrug was... And it took some minutes before we understood what was going on. Between the two of them, there was a donkey, and the name Hugo kept coming up. And it became apparent that this was Hugo's donkey. And what was happening was that, let me call him Pierre, was saying, I told Hugo that this donkey needs a haircut. It's getting desperately bad skin infections. Yes, I know, said the other one, who let's call Mark. Mark said, yes, Hugo hasn't looked after his feet at all, and the fence is going really, really bad, and I'm very worried, says Pierre. And this sounded to us like an argument. Actually, they were agreeing. They were agreeing vigorously. They were agreeing so vigorously that the donkey almost took to the other side of the field. So it's become a piece of family folklore, the fact that you can have a discussion that is an agreement, but it is actually a Hugo's donkey. And I feel very often that's what Unitarian conversations feel like. They don't feel kind, they don't feel soft, they don't even feel particularly listening from time to time, but very often they are actually agreeing. We've heard a lot about language over the past couple of days, interpreting and language. Jane made a plea that we should not renegotiate the language every time we speak. It just holds everything up. I took from Anne that how we speak drastically affects how we act. If we're speaking in patriarchal terms, then that's how we're thinking, and if we're thinking like that, then that's how we'll act. From Lewis, I got a really, really important point, and I think it came out in the questions at the end rather than in his talk, which was a deeply personal revealing, if you like. He said that in coming to his Unitarian position, he'd had to struggle and had tremendous baggage, and he hoped that his baggage would be useful to other people. That set it all in context, and it just reminds me time and time and time again, for every Unitarian there is a different drumbeat. We each march to our own drumbeat. We can't hear each other's drums. And then again, that leads us to parallel thinking. Jane's paper in particular talked about overlap. Very, very useful in thinking about the overlap between the people we might think of as the ins and the people we might think of as the outs, who actually, talking about Hugo's donkey, we just have different language over what it is that we're talking about. And again from Anne, if we're going to be thinking about parallel thinking and language to describe the same thing in different ways, we have to remember that there are complementary styles. Yes, there has been a great deal of damage done by the patriarchal, hierarchical way of doing things almost from forever till now, but we now mustn't in any way expect that we can do without the masculine. It must always be a balance. We haven't got near a balance point yet. We need to still work very, very hard, but we mustn't be imagined to be a community that are seeking to exclude the masculine or the gender theology. We must push at those new boundaries. And then, in a way, there's a tension, I think, in all of us because we're human. We're very, very bad unfinished business. It's what drives people wild. We long, as the Americans show as a nation, we long to be able to say, ta-da, we've done it, that's it, cracked. I myself, in the past 24 hours, have been in conversations where I have constructed sentences in a way that sounded to me on reflection as though I was saying, yes, but don't you see, if you just did this, that would be the answer. There is no finishment in this. There is, if there is anything, all there is a rest between musical movements in this great symphony. And I think Stephen was talking about listening and dialogue and changing, and that requires the idea of being prepared to be changed, going into a conversation, knowing from the outset that you're going to be changed, and you don't know how. And an idea about bigger. Ant used the word bigger. He said that he had to dispense with his idea, his projection of God, and the God that he has now ended up with is much bigger. Much, much bigger. And from Anne, bigger questions. And in particular, something that I think was particularly lacking last year in Manchester, this idea about embodiment. The warm body nature of theology is much bigger than the sort of the mind intellectual history that we've come from. And I really welcome that idea. And with Jane, process theology. I never had a name for it before, but everything creatures do or say affects God. Everything makes a difference to what I would say the interconnectedness that we may call God. That's a much bigger idea than just what my own faith is. The fact that I'm sitting here in front of all these faces somehow changes God. I think that's just breathtaking. And then, if I may, because I'm a pragmatist, I'm an engineer by training, I'm a pragmatist, I always am tempted at all these events to say, yes, that's fine, but what difference is going to make to me when I get back home? What am I going to do? And I'm pleased that there was mention of localism, Stephen's words, concrete communities. Somebody at some time in the last 24 hours has said something along the lines of, if perhaps we need to be better at local marketing. And I wondered if I could just crave your indulgence a little bit more to read you out the statement that we make in Ringwood that is at the moment at the top of our Facebook page if you're on Facebook. This is what we say. Unitarians are people on a search for what they can believe and who are ready to live within an open and inclusive community of differently minded other people who are likewise on their own search. Words and ideas that keep cropping up for us are oneness, conscience, integrity, compassion, community, justice, respect for difference, reverence, connectedness, open-mindedness. For some, but not all of us, the words prayer, presence, and worship are also very important. We want you with us on our spiritual journey. Come and tell us where you are on yours. We felt it was very important to get that second sentence in. People can carry out a faith and spiritual path on their own, but Unitarians are people who are ready to live in community. If that's not you, then you may not be a Unitarian. Because summing up what I think is there may have been a gap, if you like, at the heart of Unitarianism for some decades, but maybe the first theology conference last year in Manchester was the first beat of the heart again. And hearts beat. They make a noise, they stop, they rest, they beat again. And I'm glad that this is not a closed, finished thing. I'm glad that this is an open-ended nature of a discussion, and we've come to no closure. We've got no agreement about what theology is. We just have had lots of different discussions, and long may that go on. Thank you.
I think we've had a really great summing up of all the various papers and a really helpful reflection on those. So I'm going to take a slightly alternative slant of my 7 minutes, if you'd allow me. And that's to focus on something that happens at conferences, which I think often gets neglected. Obviously, conferences like this revolve around the papers, and we were treated to many good papers, and we couldn't have had the conference without them. But for me, one of the most important things of a conference is actually people coming together to hear them, because it means that you actually get those interactions in between during lunch, breakfast, teas, coffee, where you can actually ask your friends, what did you think of that? Knowing that they might well have a different answer to you, and that actually that's okay, because this just increases your own opportunity for learning. And I've had many of those interactions today, and yesterday as well. And I think that's something we have to learn. We have to learn not to be frightened to have those interactions. Lewis, in his paper, was compared to Peter Rollins a lot, and I know that Lewis is a huge Peter Rollins fan, so he loved that comparison. Peter Rollins has this interesting saying. He says that war is a result of the absence of conflict. And that's a bit odd, but what he means by that is that we should be engaged with conflict with each other for our mutual benefit, to actually build each other up, to see what parts of ourselves maybe don't stand up to scrutiny. And also just in the sake of honesty in our relationships. And also, if you don't go through that conflict process, so much tension builds up that eventually the only thing left to you is war, i.e. this sudden outbreak of violence, whether physical or not. And there's always a certain amount of tension in discussions on Unitarianism and theology, which actually was pretty much nailed by one of the last questions we had, which was expressed in that instance as, are we Christian or not? Now, before you say anything, i.e. a collective groan, I think it's very important to notice that certain forums are not useful for discussing that question. I think I've personally come to the opinion that long comment sections on various Facebook groups are not the answer to beginning to answer that question, especially when they're done by angry white-bearded men. And as an angry white-bearded man myself, I don't find it fun either. But it's still something that I think needs reflection on, and actually open, honest reflection on our parts. Although maybe I'd like to ask the question in a slightly different way, which is, are we church? Are we actually part of that larger church, Catholic with a small c, church body? And I think that brings a slightly more interesting perspective on that question, because I know atheists who, attend other denominations to our own and are perfectly happy in that setting. I know people of other religions who do likewise. We're not exclusive in our diversity, although I think we are fairly exclusive and special in how we treat it. At Mill Hill, from my own personal experience, those of us who do ministry in the community tend, though not always, to see ourselves as being part of the church in its widest ecumenical sense, I've run the trustee and director of a national ecumenical charity, and I've been perfectly welcomed into that post by people of all kinds of different denominations. Yet our church membership here is incredibly diverse and incredibly pluralistic. We have members who are active Buddhists and pagans, atheists, agnostics, who are incredibly welcome here. So personally, in my own reflection, I've kind of come to the conclusion of, well, actually, we can both be part of the church and incredibly pluralistic, because in a Unitarian view, one mandates the other. The reason why I bring this up, as I said, because I think it's been bubbling under the surface in all of these conversations we've been having. And I hope by actually naming the issue, giving a slightly alternative take, we can actually continue with that discussion, not in a way to actually beat each other up about it, because we know that achieves absolutely nothing, and it will make us all go home feeling absolutely miserable and demoralised, but actually in the hope that we can avoid greater pain by actually being honest with ourselves in the here and now in a constructive way. So it's actually those interactions that I'm going to be taking back and remembering incredibly fondly from this conference.
Thank you. I've loved today. There is no finishment. I love that poet's phrase that Lucy brought up. There is no finishment. That sense of open-endedness, perhaps being at the end of the day, but the beginning of future discussions, is wonderful. And my reflection is really going to focus on things that link to and perhaps are slightly different from what both Lucy and Robin has said. So a little bit about what debate, dialogue and conversation might be, and a little bit about metaphor. But first of all, I wrote down earlier on today, is Unitarian Theology special? Is it really special? Is it distinctive? Or are the kinds of things that are going on in it also going on in other places? Are there many other kinds of points of connection? And I want to remember Justin's point that there are moments when real radical dissent and difference opens a door. And that was something that he talked about there, when innovative, bold, radical dissent can go beyond, and in that going beyond, something else can happen. And we can find instances where that is. I began to think then about what it means to make theology in the times in which we live. As I listened, and I love what Robin said about being here, about hearing, being listeners as well as listening to speakers. Yeah, I love that thing about listening and where we are. And as I started to think about that today, I began to think about the idea of what we're listening to and the metaphors that we live by. So as we began to hear and to listen and in our own minds to converse with the speakers that we were listening to, certain metaphors began to become very clear to me. And they ended, or they continued through the day as Stephen began to talk and as he began to finish by talking about dialogue. And that's really where I want to end my reflection. Because we are always, and I've thought about this many times, standing on the edge of a river or going through a storm or entering a rocky path. One of the metaphors that I use a lot and really love a lot is the metaphor of the table. We may not agree, but we can always share a table. We don't have to agree to draw up a chair. And I often think about Unitarianism as the table now, as a place which can create that connective space between the secular and the sacred, between religions. I'm troubled in the best possible way by the idea of debate and dialogue. And I've been quite influenced by a thinker called Scott Atran, who at Harris Manchester College is director of the Centre for the Reconciliation of Intractable Conflict. And one of the things that he talks about is the way in which conversation and dialogue are very different, that we can have conversation around a table where we don't need to come from a particular position. And so we actually, in a non-binary way, I want to kind of introduce that as well, a way that's much more fluid, we can step aside from the need to entrench our positions and convert someone else to them. I don't have an answer to that. I just think it's kind of that it's really worth saying. There's an American NPR podcast that I listen to called On Being with Krista Tippett, who's a theologian. And one of the things that she's done on her program is to get people of very different sorts together, someone who is homophobic with someone who's an advocate for equal marriage, someone who's anti-abortion, someone who's pro-choice, and to say to them in a wonderful way, what do you envy about the other side? What do you like about them? What would you like to be? And I'm left at the end of this day feeling that with a very academic word, methodology, if you like, that the methodology through which we go through our engagements and discussions, our listening, our hearing, our tuning in, our getting around the table, is as important to us as what's actually said. And I'm really interested in that idea, that Unitarianism can also be about theological methodologies, that it can be about the how, the praxis, if you like, the way that we do things.
I've been wondering the third time, the last 2 days, whether it's useful, and this is a methodological point, which I thought was a very interesting one, whether it's useful to talk about being a Unitarian, and whether it might be better to talk about being a member of a Unitarian church.
I actually think that's quite interesting, because where I am in Ringwood, where we've started again 3.5 years ago after a gap of some 30 years or more, without any of the old baggage. We're actually looking at it the other way round. So quite literally quite the converse. We're saying we don't call ourselves a group or a fellowship. We just call ourselves people. We are Unitarians. So we are Unitarians in Ringwood. We're not even Ringwood Unitarians because most of us don't live there. We are Unitarians in Ringwood. We've got a constitution because we're trying to do things properly from the start. Our constitution defines us in very secular language. We're a society. I don't quite know why we have felt it necessary to do this, but it did feel necessary to not say Unitarianism, Unitarian Church, Unitarian Fellowship, almost as if we didn't know what any of those things were. But we do know what we are. We know that we are people. And of the signed-up members at the muster this year, 2 would self-define as Unitarians. The other would not, but she's still a member. So it's actually quite tricky. Which comes first? Is it the church that comes first and it has members, or is it the people first coalesce around ideas? I don't know. It's a good question.
I second the fact it's a really good question. I would add that I would not have the whole answer to that question because otherwise I think, you'd be paying me a lot to actually get that answer because it's it's one that I think occupies a lot of our minds, actually. And with actually quite practical things. So our denomination as a whole doesn't actually have its own Facebook page. It's really interesting that we kind of struggle with actually forming that sort of identity as a whole for going outwards. And maybe individual churches are better placed to actually form their own identity and do that locally. Although that would also be a shame on many grounds. It's really a shame to stop ourselves from having a voice on national issues. So as I said, I really don't know the answer to that, although it's a question that I think is becoming incredibly urgent for us to begin to think through.
I'm very interested to hear what other people think, but as someone who's been very much part of the One Left domestic mission in Bethnal Green, I feel there very much that we're Unitarians, and we're the Unitarians, and we're connecting outwards with the community. So it's not really about being a member of a church there, but it's definitely about Unitarian values and Unitarian practice.
Mark Hutchinson, student at Unitarian College, Manchester, qualifying hopefully next year. I've discovered at this conference I have a camper van, which I'm hoping to use in my ministry once I'm qualified. I appear to be 100 years out of date. And I just wondered if the panel, I am not saying I will do this, but if they had a message they would like me to put on the side of the camper van.
I would say that on your conference folders, there's a really interesting strapline which we as a congregation have been using, and that might just about fit on a camper van. Although I think the other thing I'd like to add is that I've often admired admired maybe the wrong word. I found it surprising how many Unitarian ministers, in fact, have boats rather than camper vans. So maybe the canals are beginning to replace the wagons. Maybe that's an update that you might want to confer Van How on.
More seriously, I organised an anniversary service in Rosslyn Hill in London a couple of years ago, and we invited other ministers of other faith groups. And one particularly acerbic friend of mine from the Church of England, I was sitting next to him as Kate explained some of the heritage of the Unitarian movement. And she said, we used to be persecuted and regarded as heretics. And my Church of England friend muttered, we don't persecute you anymore, we just think you're heretics. But at the end, he said, I was waiting for the moment of transubstantiation in Unitarian terms, and I realised, he said, that it's your desire to help others and not yourself.
I remember that the Ecumenical Churches Together officer in Manchester, who was a Methodist, while rejecting the Unitarian plea to be a full member, said that he thought that our vocation was to be on the margins. And that's quite a powerful place to be. If you're thinking of a Venn diagram with the church being a big circle, we're a small circle, half in, half out. And there is quite a lot of feminist work about the power of being on the margins, having the view from the outside as well as the view of the inside, and being able to talk and possibly mediate between the two. So there's a lot to be said to being on the margins.
Been talking a lot about having conversations and dialogues, which is great, and I've realised how much work it's obviously taken to bring the today and yesterday together, to have these conversations and dialogues. And I'm wondering, as Unitarians in some of our churches and chapels, whether because we say people can believe whatever they want to believe, whether we're not prepared to actually put the work in so that people can have those conversations and those dialogues. And as an add-on, are we sometimes afraid of the answer?
Matthew Smith has a question, and if I don't mention him, then he won't watch next time, so I've got to mention it. Sorry, though. He's basically saying, how do we move forward on what we've been talking about? Some wonderful discussions, some wonderful ideas, but he's asking, where do we go from here?
Thank you very much. That's from our cyber audience. That's great. Let's take a final question from Marta from here, and then ask the panel to reflect, just a short reflection each, including, I'm sure, Matthew Smith's response to Matthew Smith's question.
So it's funny because I put my hand up before, but hey, Matthew, this might actually speak to your question a bit, because with what Anne just said, and then I think yesterday Ant was talking about as more mainline denominations become more liberal, what do we do? And I would say, how do we keep leaving out our heritage identity if we want to keep it? And I'm reminded of a universalist, I think early 20th century, I can't remember what their name was, but he was asked, so where do universalists stand on this particular issue? And his answer was, universalists don't stand at all, we move. And maybe that's our answer, to keep moving.
Thank you very much, Marta. And now just to ask the panel to each just make a closing comment, a reflection on what's been said in the last few minutes particularly.
Well, I'm wondering whether the movement, the margins, the where do we go from here, this reminds me of the leading wake of a boat. Boats make two wakes, the one at the front and the one at the back. As the boat pushes through the water, it has to cut the water. It has to move the water. It's hard work. It's like slipstreaming in a bicycle peloton. The one at the front does the hard work, other people slipstream on behind. Maybe that's where we are, the sharp end, the point, the being the adjutants, the people who have to do the hardest work to cut the new ground, if you like. And we don't care, do we? If those values are universal, as we heard, if those values are divine, then we should rejoice when other people adopt them, not just complain. How do we do the work in our congregations and our groups and our whatever to allow these conversations to carry on? Well, there's coffee and biscuits. That's sort of what we do. The trick is somehow catching their imaginations with a short enough service to allow their morning Sunday slot to include that conversation afterwards. And this is why it's dangerous giving me a microphone, because I always go on too long. It's the same thing. Don't talk too long, I think, is the answer.
Thanks, Lucy.
I think something I'd like to pick up on is sort of like the idea that we say to people who come in through our door, you can believe anything you want to. I'm not necessarily sure that's the case. I think we do actually have limits as a denomination. Yes, I've just been shown, they can believe, but there's no, you're entitled to believe, but I'm not sure there's certain beliefs I would not like to affirm people in holding. And I think we always need to be wary of that. We're not a pick and mix movement when it comes to absolutely everything. I think in terms of what we do now with Matthew's question is we should keep doing theology, and that doesn't just mean doing conferences and writing papers and having those discussions, but it also means in the fullness of doing theology. Theology is not just about theory, it's also about how you practice it. It's a praxis. The whole of my religion is. And I think something I would love to see Unitarians doing more in theology is actually public theology. We have a lot to say to the world, and we can't just do internal things. We also have to do external things in our theology too.
I just want to second that. I think what's been extraordinary about this gathering is the way in which theology is now really on the table. And that's a very generative process, I think. That's a process. That's what's going to go on. And it's what I think of as exploring our spiritual commons. As somebody who's just trained as a minister and done an MA in Abrahamic theology, I've learned a huge amount from, for instance, Muslima theology about feminism lately, from talks across faith. So ways of having those conversations. The last thing I want to say is that public theology, I think, is where one place we have a responsibility to start to claim and work out how to have public voice. Last week I spoke at the Wellcome Trust with Andy Pakula, and it was part of an art project on faith. We had lots of people there, and people were really, really interested. And there isn't any reason why we can't be in those public engagement situations. And I think it's really important that we find ourselves there and really start to engage with them, because every time I'm in those situations, people are really eager and open and want to have what we want to talk about as well. So I think conversation and public theology and dialogue, and I think this has been a fantastic place to nourish ourselves with words, actually, so that we can go out and do some of that.